Hi everyone, welcome to the Whiteleyverse with me, Connor Whiteley, for another daily short story. Now, before I start today's story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you want to buy this short story and any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers and at your local bookstore and local library if you requested, and you can order paperback copies from Amazon. Now, here's today's short story. I hope you enjoyed just as much as I did writing it.
Day to Remember. The 20th of November 2023. London, England. She was about to have the most chilling phone call of her life.
Just have a coffee already.
As much as Private Eye Bettie English really liked her personal assistant Fran because she was kind, helpful, and an amazing assistant that basically oversaw the day-to-day running of the British Private Eye Federation, so Betty could focus on helping people and solving cases, Betty just had to admit Fran was being a nightmare today. Betty had never really liked coming into her massive, executive office at the Federation's headquarters in London. Sure, she loved the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed her to see all over London, and its immensely impressive skyline. She had always liked to watch the little white boats on the Thames, watch people coming and going in from the Houses of Parliament, and see the happy tourists walking about below. But the office just wasn't her home, or even where she liked to work. Betty wanted to be out on the streets, in the community, and talking to the amazing people that her and her fellow private investigators helped every day. She seriously loved being president of the Federation, but not when she had to give speeches. "Do you want a coffee?" Fran asked. Betty just looked at Fran across her massive black glass desk with her 3 computer screens to one side, her laptop open with her emails and a small plate of Danish pastries. Betty would have preferred if Fran had gotten the pastries from a small local business, instead of a major international corporation, but Fran had been in a rush apparently. But Betty couldn't deny the pastries smelt great, with hints of vanilla, sugar and sweet strawberries filling the office. She could almost taste those wonderful strawberries on her tongue, but she wasn't going to give in to temptation just yet. She had a speech to write. And she was really hoping something was going to pop up in the meantime, to stop her.
"No thank you," Betty said. "I don't want a coffee.
I want to get this speech done." "Why are you even doing a speech on pro-transgender healthcare? We all support trans people, but we're private investigators, not politicians or doctors," Fran asked. Betty smiled as she heard the muttering and shouting of people walking outside her office. That was actually the question Betty had been wondering herself. She had only been talking to her wonderful nephew Sean and his boyfriend last month about the awful state of transgender rights and healthcare in the UK. She completely agreed it needed to improve, and these great people needed to be supported. But she couldn't remember the exact moment where she had signed up to give a major keynote at a medical convention later on tonight. Thankfully, she had 6 hours left. Betty just knew that wouldn't be enough time to write something worthy on the topic, considering how many lives and livelihoods it could affect. She was the president of the Federation, her words had power. She could influence people positively, or damn entire communities. That was a hell of a burden. Betty's phone rang. Fran went to grab it from the desk, but Betty grabbed it first and answered. "Miss English, is that you?" A man's voice said on the phone.
"Yes, who is this?"
Betty asked.
"I'm sorry for the call, but you don't know me."
"I got your name and number from Percy Munchin. He said if I was ever in trouble, you would help me." As soon as the caller said Percy's name, Betty just grinned. She hadn't heard from Percy for years, but he was a great man, a brilliant speaker, and one of the kindest men Betty had ever had the privilege of meeting. Granted, she had thought he was a serial killer for a few days, but after that business was sorted out, he was delightful.
"Yes, I can help you."
"I think," Betty said, gesturing Fran to run a trace on the call. "Percy also said you would trace the call, and try to work out who I was. I'll save you the trouble. My name is Penelope Gray, and me and my friends need your help because someone is threatening to kill us all tonight." Betty gasped and nodded at Fran. The voice, the chosen name of Penelope, and the fact it was the 20th of November made Betty realize instantly that these death threats had to be connected to what today was for the trans community. Transgender Day of Remembrance was today, a chance for everyone in the world to remember, honor, and want to support all the trans people that had been murdered in the last year for the simple reason of wanting to be themselves. Betty had stopped checking the numbers a few years back, because the number of murders only increased year on year. It was disgusting, but Betty had a chance to save lives, and she fully intended to take it, no matter how heartbreaking the situation might be. "I'll be there immediately," Betty said, hanging up as Fran finished the trace. The 20th of November 2023. Canterbury, England. One thing Betty did love about being president of the Federation was the UK government allowed it to have its own array of vehicles with blue flashing lights. It meant she never had to wait in traffic. She loved that little detail. As the massive black SUV she was in the back of started to drive into Canterbury, Betty smiled as she was home. She liked seeing the thick oak, pine and silver birch trees lining the exit off the motorway. And in the distance the impressive flint city wall that dated back to Roman times stood proudly. Betty couldn't wait to go home later on and see her boyfriend Graham, 2 beautiful kids and Sean. No doubt he would love her even more for helping out innocent trans people on today of all days. As much as Betty wanted to focus on her speech, something she had barely started writing on the way here, she just wanted to save the lives of these innocent people. She wouldn't allow another person to die, especially on a day that was meant to be about remembering the murdered. Not adding to that evil tally. She settled back in the soft, wonderfully warm car seat, as Fran passed over an iPad with photos. Betty was surprised by the slight coldness of the iPad, but she took it. Betty couldn't believe how disgusting the images were. They were all photos of the outside of a local church with red paint, animal blood, and anti-trans comments painted on the cream-bricked walls of the church. Betty felt her stomach tighten as she read the warnings, the death threats and all the disgusting stuff the attackers were saying. She just couldn't believe that people in the 21st century could be so foul to other people just because politicians and bigots said this was okay. It was disgusting. "We'll be there in a minute, Madam President," John said from the front of the SUV. Betty just nodded. She had always liked John as her new head of security. She didn't think she needed John for a slight second, but she wanted to keep beautiful Graham happy, after a massive assassination attempt, more like attempts, were made on her a few months ago.
"What did the police say?"
Betty asked, passing the iPad back to Fran.
"Nothing.
Simple case of vandalizing, and this is not the job of the police where there are more important cases to investigate," Fran said. Betty laughed. "Let me guess, the police aren't interested in actionable death threats made against trans people."
"Of course not," Fran said.
Betty shook her head as the SUV pulled to a stop, and John opened the door for Betty. She got out and shivered a little, and pulled her thick black trench coat around tighter. She wasn't exactly a fan of the small square car park they were in, but she supposed John would have liked it with its thick tree cover, high brick walls covered in death threats, and no one else was about. Even though Betty really didn't like the cracked roof tiles, and the plastic pipes hanging off the roofs of the surrounding almost abandoned former council houses. Of the few windows Betty could see behind the tall walls, they all looked cracked, cold and ugly. Betty had a bad feeling about this. Something just felt off. The rich aroma of curries, spices and crispy bacon filled the air, and Betty was so tempted to find whatever restaurant that was coming from. Then she laughed as Fran brought over a small box of Danish pastries and ate one.
"I'm not leaving these behind," Fran said.
"Fair enough," Betty said, smiling before turning to a very tall woman coming towards them. Betty had to admit Penelope was an impressive woman with her long brown hair, slim body, and tight black peacoat that highlighted her feminine body really well. "I like your coat, it's great," Betty said, trying to be as supportive and affirming as she could. Penelope nodded her thanks, and gestured to the death threats painted on the walls. Betty shook her head, but these were different from the ones in the photos. There were brush marks, angles, and even small pieces of fabric mixed into the paint here. The words were written too quickly and harshly to be readable, but Betty understood the general message. This person wanted every single trans person to die in the world. I didn't send photos of these because I don't know. We don't know who did these ones, Penelope said, clearly trying to practice her voice training. Who did the photos you send us? Betty asked.
Just some local kids.
The children of the priests of another church. Why? Fran asked, coming closer.
And why would a trans group meet in a church?
I thought the church hated trans people. Penelope nodded. On principle, yes, but there are some churches that accept us and other queer people. This is a good one. Betty looked at the massive church a few meters away from the car park. She wanted to force a smile. She couldn't. She just couldn't forgive churches and religion for what it had done to the queer community and her beautiful nephew. Betty went over to the rough writing Penelope was focusing on. She took a pair of blue crime scene gloves that Fran gave her, as she also came over. I have no idea who did this, Penelope said, but I just don't want my friends to die. Betty nodded as she knelt down and inspected the markings on the walls. The paint wasn't exactly dry, and it was sticky and thick. It might not have been paint at all.
Why do these idiots think you'll be easy pickings tonight?
Betty asked, after reading a line of hate. Penelope frowned. We have a Trans Day of Remembrance service tonight in the church. We'll be reading out over 390 names. Jesus, Betty said. That was way too many dead people, and Betty hated it how her stomach twisted at the idea of the speech tonight. Betty shook the thought away, and focused back on the hate writing in front of her. The ground was awfully cold and rough, but Betty ran a finger over the writing, and a red sticky substance came off the wall.
Fran, Betty said, is this fake blood from productions and film sets?
Definitely, Fran said. My daughter uses this a lot in her productions. It's really cheap stuff, but it's effective for budget movies. Betty was really pleased Fran's daughter was finally getting the chance to produce her own indie films, and Fran was traveling to Venice next year to hopefully see her daughter get an award. Betty couldn't have been more pleased for Fran. Why use false blood from film sets? Penelope asked. Betty stood up and looked over at the walls of the church. Even from a small distance, Betty could see the markings, writing, and death threats were all different. These definitely weren't done by the same person. Stop there! John shouted. Betty froze and saw that John was pointing his small sidearm, something Betty forgot he had, at a young man walking into the car park. He was focused on Penelope, dressed in all black, and Betty just knew he was here to hurt Penelope. Something she wasn't going to allow. I said stop. I'm licensed to shoot, John said. The SUV's horn went off. Betty looked around. There were more young men in all black entering the car park. Most were climbing over the walls. Stop! Betty shouted with as much authority as she could. You will not harm her. The young men all stopped, and Betty couldn't tell them apart in their all-black clothing. He ain't a woman, the young man said that John was aiming at. He's an unholy slut. He ain't in the Bible, another young man said. Betty also wanted to point out the Bible said a person could be stoned for wearing 2 different types of fabric, but this probably wasn't the time for Bible lessons. She is a woman, Betty said. It is ridiculous that you have nothing better to do than attack people and threaten them. Betty gestured to the vandalism on the wall behind her. We ain't do that, bitch, another young man said. Betty was about to protest, but she believed him. These were young men, clearly religious, and Penelope had said sons of priests had attacked the church. Someone else was behind these focused death threats. The young men charged. John fired. The bullet screamed through the air, hitting the man's leg. He went down. The other young men charged. Betty grabbed Penelope, throwing her towards John. John gripped her, throwing Penelope into the SUV. Betty charged forward, rushing towards the young men. They stopped. Betty didn't. She punched them, giving them a left hook, then right hook, then jabs to the stomach. 2 young men fell to the floor. Betty ducked. A fist shot past her from behind. Betty spun around, punching another man in the balls. He slammed to the ground. Betty stood up and just grinned, as there were no more attackers around, and Fran and Penelope were getting back out of the SUV. "Madam President, how am I meant to protect you if you don't get to cover?" John asked, grinning. Betty shrugged as she went over to the young man that John had shot. She was more than glad not a lot of blood had come out of the wound, and it seemed to be just a flesh wound. Of course the young man was rolling about, acting like a big baby, but Betty placed her right boot on his chest and looked down at him. His eyes opened and Betty just smiled.
"I never like hurting people," Betty said.
"I hate it, but this was self-defense." "I'll call an ambulance," Fran said, "and the police." Betty had no idea what the point of calling the police was. If her boyfriend Graham was still a cop, then he could deal with this, but some corrupt officials had made that option impossible. "Why are you defending a bitch?" the young man asked. Betty took her boot off his chest and helped the young man up. She threw one of his arms round her shoulders and Betty grabbed him by the waist. "Look at her," Betty said. "Actually, look at Penelope. She isn't a monster, she isn't crazy. She's just a woman wanting to live a normal life." "He ain't a woman." Betty took her arm off his waist, and the young man struggled to stand, so he fell back down to the ground, and Betty shivered a little as an icy cold breeze blew in the car park. "Who did this?" Betty asked. "You have to know something about this. You cannot be the only transphobe in Canterbury." The young man grinned. Betty went over to him and searched his pockets. He tried to protest, but it wasn't hard to find his locked phone.
"Fran, I need the unlocker, please,"
Betty asked. A moment later, Fran came off and passed Betty a small USB stick-like device that Betty held over the phone screen, and a moment later she was in. "That ain't legal," the young man said, who turned out to be Charlie. "I'm a private eye. I don't need to follow the law at times." Betty wanted to add on how she would never follow the law if it meant saving lives, but she didn't want to get Charlie fired up again. Betty went through his contacts and apps, and she found a strange social networking app called 2G. Betty rolled her eyes as soon as she clicked on it, and the motto "There are only 2 genders" popped up on the screen. A second later, Betty was scrolling through thousands upon thousands of anti-trans messages. There were pictures of dead bodies, mutilated corpses, and extremely transphobic memes. Betty shivered and closed the app. That was outrageous and sickening, and just disgusting. Some of the pictures of dead trans people barely seemed to be 18. She just looked at Charlie, and she took a deep breath of the rich curry-scented air. It barely calmed her down enough not to kick him in the nuts. It was the least he deserved. Fran took Charlie's phone, gasped, and then looked like she was doing some techie stuff to do it with more advanced gadgets the Federation had access to. The loud beep of sirens filled the air, as 2 ambulances and 2 police cars came into the car park. Betty just rolled her eyes. This wasn't what she needed. 2 police constables came out with handcuffs and started to walk towards Betty, but Betty just showed them her Federation ID. The constables sighed and went off to the real criminals that were still rolling and screaming about on the floor. She was more than glad the police were too scared to arrest Federation members at times. "Bet," Fran said, coming over as paramedics dealt with Charlie, "look at this contact." Betty sadly looked at the app again, and noticed how Charlie was constantly talking to another user called Gender 2. Betty didn't want to read them, as she felt her breakfast and lunch start to crawl up her throat again. "Find him," Betty said. "Find her, you mean," Fran said. "The user might have used a VPN, so I couldn't find their IP address, but photos on their profile gave me information about their phone. I eventually got a serial number, and I know who owns it." "Who?" Betty asked, wanting back over to the SUV. "Layla Taylor, a local lecturer of religion at Kent University," Fran said. Betty slammed the door shut as the SUV roared away. She was going to deal with Layla once and for all. No one got away with attempted murder, not if she could help it. The 20th of November 2023. Hales Place, Canterbury, England. Betty just grinned to herself as she walked down a very long main road just on the outskirts of Canterbury. The area used to be a massive council estate, but mainly students used the small cheap houses as places to live. Betty rather liked the little white small houses that lined the wide road. A few blue, black and red cars drove past, making a small cold breeze blow past her, only adding to the already bitter temperature surrounding her. Betty pulled her coat tight as she smiled at Layla Taylor, who was currently getting out of her little black Fiat outside a small house. She had to admit Layla wasn't an awful-looking woman. She was skinny, attractive, and her wavy black hair was probably attractive to a lot of men, including young male students. "Layla Taylor," Betty said. Yes," she said, looking at Betty.
"Or should I call you Gender too?"
Betty asked.
"It's hard to keep track of names, isn't it?"
Layla frowned.
"I do not have time for this."
Betty took 2 large steps forward and closed the gap between her and Layla. Betty wasn't allowing Layla to get away. "You incited a young man called Charlie to try and kill an innocent woman today," Betty said.
"I don't know what you're talking about."
Betty just grinned. She liked difficult suspects because it meant she got to play with them, and hopefully that would give Fran more time to work with Sean and his boyfriend Harry on the computer stuff to find what she needed. Penelope was an innocent person. "Why attack her and her group?" Betty asked. "Because the Bible told you to do it." Layla glared at Betty. "How dare you? How dare you use the Bible in that tone?" Betty took a few steps away from her, as she noticed the awful aroma of sweat and urine filling the space between them. "I have my people investigating all your online activity as we speak. You might be able to explain away the extreme transphobia, but what about your relationships with students?" Betty loved it how pale Layla went. "You should technically be at work, you know. It isn't 5 p.m. yet, and why would you be going to a student's house?" Betty asked. Layla came over to her, and Betty felt a cold knife press against her stomach. "Leave me alone." Betty shook her head. She couldn't do that. There were innocent people and lives at stake. She wasn't going to back down.
"Then die, bitch."
A shot screamed through the air, and Betty just gasped as warm blood splattered over her face and her entire body went icy cold. She slowly looked to her right, and nodded her thanks as John stood a good 20 meters further up the road. The 20th of November 2023. London, England. Betty still shook a little, as she sat in the wonderfully warm, soft SUV, as it slowly drove through the busy, packed and noisy streets of London later that night. The gentle humming of the SUV running, the loud honking of car horns and people shouting outside made Betty smile a little. This really was a typical night of traffic in London. John had asked about using the blue flashing lights, but Betty had shaken her head. She actually wanted the time to think. She was already late for the medical conference, but they were still allowing her to present whenever she got there. Betty just didn't know if she could say anything worthy after today's events, the attempted murder, and the death threat of Layla. Betty looked at Fran as she typed away on her laptop, probably finishing up their official statements for the Federation and the police. Then Betty looked down at the small wooden box of amazing, delicious-looking Danish pastries that looked so good in between them. The rich aromas of strawberries filled the SUV. Betty reached down and picked one up, enjoying the touch of the buttery pastries as it coated her fingers in butter and rich icing. She was looking forward to having one of them, after all. "You feeling okay now?" Fran asked, putting her laptop away. Betty shrugged. She had seen people die before in different situations, but never exactly in front of her. She had seen her personal assistant die before in front of her, but that situation had been different. That was an assassination attempt, not a killing done by her own security detail. Layla's death had to happen, but Betty never wanted it to happen though. "I've sent the Federation's tech unit information about the app," Fran said. "They'll pass on everything to the police in time, and we'll make sure the police deal with the hate website." "Thank you," Betty said, bringing the pastry closer to her lips.
I don't know what I'm going to say tonight.
The car jerked a little as it hit a pothole. Fran laughed.
Just do what you always do.
Talk from the heart and enjoy it. It's why the members love you talking, and it's why I love listening to you. Betty grinned and just nodded to herself because that was exactly right, and that was exactly what she was going to do tonight. She might have been president of the Federation, but that didn't mean she had to write official speeches. She was a woman of the people, and she was a woman of action. Betty's place wasn't in some office, it was on the streets solving crimes, helping people and improving lives. She had never needed to write a speech. "Use the blue lights now, please." "Of course, Madam President." Betty just grinned as the SUV started its blue lights, and they slowly started making progress through the traffic, because she had a speech to deliver to some medical and political folks. Because it was Transgender Day of Remembrance. It might have been a day about honoring the murdered and dead, trans people, amazing people whose lives had been cut too short.
But there was a purpose as well.
It was making sure none of those people died in vain. So Betty was going to go on that stage and she was going to convince people to help, support and improve transgender healthcare, because everyone was entitled to healthcare, even trans people. Because at the end of the day, trans people were just people wanting to live a better life, which was what everyone wanted, so why should trans lives be harder or lesser than anyone else's? They shouldn't. And Betty was so glad she had finally realized that simple point, and that certainly helped to make today a day to remember. A day where she had solved a crime, saved lives and made sure a horrible transphobe could never hurt people ever again. If that wasn't a day to remember, then Betty really wasn't sure what was.
Welcome back everyone, it's me again, Connor Whiteley. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's story, because I flat out love writing, creating stories and sharing them with you. If you really enjoyed today's story, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithms. And if you want to buy this short story or any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get them from your local library if you requested, and you can order the paperback copies from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. Lastly, if you want to support the channel on a one-off basis, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. Also, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's story, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help us spread the word about the channel. So, thanks for watching the Whiteleyverse, and I'll see you again soon. Have a great day, everyone.